Hi there, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Ken Ellingwood, the author of First to Fall, Elijah Lovejoy, and the Fight for a Free Press in the Age of Slavery. He's a former correspondent with the LA Times and has reported from all over the world. This is his second book. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Elllingwood.
Really happy to be with you.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We just made a donation from your contributions to Reach Out and Read, a program that makes books a part of the pediatric healthcare process. Freedom of the press isn't free. Sometimes it's deadly. For Elijah Lovejoy, abolitionist, it was deadly because those defending the ultimate system of oppression insisted that he stop calling them out for it. He died in a hail of bullets as he tried to defend his printing press. Ken writes that, if I may call you Ken writes that Lovejoy reminds us a free press is not just a clause in the Bill of Rights, but a cause that has been cultivated and defended by generations of its practitioners. Lovejoy was the first of them to fall. When and why, Ken, did you decide this story needed a modern perspective?
The book has a great origin story in that I was teaching journalism in China at Nanjing University after a career at the LA Times. And I was appointed as a visiting fellow and was teaching a class in the history of American journalism to Chinese students when I introduced them to Elijah Lovejoy as part of a section we were doing on abolitionism and journalism. And I was very struck by how they really were captivated by his story and how much they saw him as a hero in their terms, really, for fighting against bigger powers and for standing up for principle. And I was so struck by their reaction to him that I started thinking to myself, gee, I wonder if there's more here to be said, or if there's something that could be said in a different way than it has been. And I started digging into Lovejoy's life and his story. During my summers back in the United States, I would go to libraries and archives and really started to learn about Lovejoy and realized that there's a great story to be told in a modern way with a modern context, sort of assumed. I don't try to hit that very hard in the book, but I think some of these themes really cry out, and so I pursued it and I wrote the book.
Let's have you give some background on who I would consider to be the reporter's reporter, Elijah Lovejoy. He's born in 1802 in Maine to parents who were uneducated, at least academically speaking. What was in Maine? And I want you to include some religion in this answer because it certainly helped shape Elijah Lovejoy. What were his parents like? So often we see great people in history come from these kinds of beginnings.
Yeah, it's 1802. Maine was very sparsely settled. It was still part of the state of Massachusetts at the time. And his family lived on a piece of land in central Maine in a town called Albion. And they were farmers, just, family farmers, and all very religious in their orientation. His father was a Congregationalist minister, and Congregationalist churches were pretty much everywhere up in New England at that time. His mother was not formally educated in religion, but she was very devout, and she came from a religious family herself, and was very, very learned in topics of religion. So Elijah and his brothers and sisters grew up in a context where religion was kind of all around them, and that's not that unusual. Religion was a very important part of the lives of most early Americans. Many people, owned only one book in the home, and that was the Bible. So it wasn't unusual for him to be, soaked in with religion. But he he had a very defined, moral sense of right and wrong from that environment, and he would act upon that. Later in his life, he was very certain of what was the right thing and what was the wrong thing. He was, as a child, really smart and really quite a talented writer. He went on to Waterville College, which is now Colby College, and graduated at the top of his class. He wrote poetry and really thought at some point he might try to make a living with his words, and he did.
Maine was not a state yet, as you mentioned, but it does become a free state, and it becomes a signature, I guess, free state, if you want to put it that way, because it is ultimately traded as part of the Missouri Compromise when Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, which is also interesting because Elijah Lovejoy winds up there, but right. Maine becomes the free state. So where can we start to find his anti-slavery views, and were those views grounded in the sentiment in Maine?
Maine was certainly a place where there was anti-slavery sentiment when it began to show itself in an organized fashion in the say late 1820s and 1830s. Really, for Elijah Lovejoy, I think we have to see the beginnings of it all in that moral training that I talked about before. There was really no hint of any kind of activism in his early life, and he didn't particularly show much interest, even as an adult, in the slavery issue until after he had moved to St. Louis, until after he had become the editor of a newspaper, and after he had received religious training as a minister in the Presbyterian Church. At that point, and now we're talking in the early 1830s, Lovejoy is, he's just entered his 30s, and he begins to pay attention in a way he hasn't before to the issue of slavery. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but from his early, childhood and growing up, I can find a very strong, moral core that would prove to be the motor for his later activism.
One of the things you say in the book is that America, as he is, and I guess America is always changing, but America is really changing as he starts to grow up. Transportation gets easier. There's more awareness that we can travel from one place to another and live somewhere. Why not? I'll go to Missouri. Explain how he winds up going to St. Louis, and then where St. Louis is in the early 1930s in the context of America and its argument over slavery.
Lovejoy is a pretty restless soul for a man who grew up in such a little tiny burg. He has this yearning to go somewhere else, and he doesn't quite know to do what exactly, except that he has a belief that there is some way to serve God in this. Now, he's not yet a minister or anything like that, but he speaks with people, his elders, and at the college too, who are all men of God, religious people. And the message that comes through is that the West is where the action is. We call it now, that's the Midwest, of course. But at that time, Missouri, St. Louis, was the far West. And so Lovejoy kind of buys into this idea that the fight for the moral well-being of the United States will be fought in the West. This is a notion that had been nurtured by Lyman Beecher and some other religious leaders who believed that that was going to be the front, sort of good versus evil, and where the moral bearing of America would be decided. He walks on foot across much of New England as part of this journey to the West, and ends up in St. Louis, where he, after a short amount of time running a school, he ends up as an editor of a secular newspaper called the St. Louis Times. And it's a conventional newspaper of the time, very partisan, tied to the Whigs' philosophy. And as I mentioned before, he still hadn't shown a lot of interest yet in the slavery issue, but it was there all around him because Missouri was a slave state. And St. Louis was an embarkation point for slave traders transporting slaves to the South.
This is a major aside, but can you imagine walking across New England without the advantage of modern shoes and sneakers?
Oh, it's tremendous. And he writes about how hard it is. I mean, he runs out of money. He's got to hawk a watch. He's staying in these taverns that you can tell this kid from this little podunk town who's never seen anything is kind of horrified at there are ladies there.
Right.
He's really quite taken, but it was really quite arduous. The funny thing is, I mean, people did this sort of thing in that era. They walked, in the early 1800s, and yet at the same time, it was the moment of a great transportation revolution. And he also took advantage of that. I mean, the Erie Canal, was built in the 1820s. There, he rode as part of his journey west. He rode on the Erie Canal, and so he took advantage of both sides of it. He was traveling the old-fashioned way on foot, but he was also enjoying the fruits of this really exciting revolution, both in transportation and mobility. Americans were on the move in the 1820s and the 1830s, and it's really this remarkable period that I think often gets just overlooked. It was very exciting, and he's part of it.
I would certainly suggest anybody walking across that part of the country do that in summer as opposed to winter. Was it summer or winter? Do you remember?
It was late spring.
All right,
he was already
that's a good time to do it.
Yeah,
That's
it was already hot too. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Where and how did he develop this idea that an American can say what they want? As you explain in the book, we take it for granted now. And as a matter of fact, there was a fascinating ruling today from the Supreme Court that said even a high school student can go on a curse-laden tirade and have that speech protected, because Justice Breyer, I think it was, wrote, sometimes you have to protect the superfluous in order to protect the necessary. But that is not the way it was back then in the 1820s. We take it for granted now. State by state, though, things were state by state back then. There had not been these legal precedents set. He draws on the founding documents for this idea that an American can say what they want, right?
Yeah, he does. And you have to go back to this era to kind of see how courageous he was to hold this belief that, we can print anything we want. I have the right to do this, no matter what anybody says. And it was really a gray area, right? It was the First Amendment is written, as part of the Constitution, and according to that, the Congress can't pass any laws to abridge the freedom of the press. But there had been no evidence, really, no court rulings or any cases to back that up, to show, well, when the rubber meets the road, yeah, journalists really have this right. So he was in this fog, and yet, legally speaking, that is. And yet he and many other editors at the time believed that they were free to write what they wanted to. And if you read the newspapers of the time, including the secular paper that he started with in St. Louis, they really go at it with each other. You would say, this is a free country. These people are expressing opinions. In fact, oftentimes that's all they express. There's not a whole lot of reporting in a lot of these newspapers. They're very partisan, and they call each other names, one editor to another, and they have these great, debates across from one week to the next across the pages of their newspapers. And what you realize is that Americans at the time believed that they had freedom of the press. And in Lovejoy's case, his belief was really enough. Because he believed he had freedom to publish what he wanted to, he did publish what he wanted to. Could he point to a court ruling to say, well, see, it says right here that I can say this or do this? No, he just believed it, and that was enough.
Describe the newspaper industry for us a little bit in the 1820s and 30s. What was it like back then? How were papers shipped around? Where did papers come from? How many were there? And why did people love reading newspapers?
Americans were newspaper junkies. since the colonial times, there were readers of newspapers. Newspapers played a role in the cause for independence. And after independence in the young country, newspapers were already, part of the American DNA. Foreigners who came to the United States were really taken by this. They noticed how addicted to newspapers Americans were, how many newspapers there were, and just how important newspapers were in organizing society. Writers like Alexis Tocqueville noted the important sort of adhesive function of newspapers in the society, and other writers noticed that even in the smallest town there was a newspaper. So Americans were really fans of newspapers, and newspapers expanded greatly during the early decades of independence, after independence of the country's life. And by the 1830s, they really started to flower. One of the things that helped bind Americans, you could say, is the industry of journalism. It bound the country, which was growing rapidly. I mentioned earlier, there was a very mobile time. People are moving all over. There's a lot of migration from east to west. So how do you hold this place together? Well, one of the agents that held the country together was the newspaper, and they traded newspapers. Newspapers would have exchanges with others. So the way it worked was a newspaper editor in St. Louis might subscribe to a bunch of newspapers back east. Those newspapers were placed in bags of mail, and the U.S. government, through the mail system, would ship them around at a very cheap rate. A lot of, during the time, Lovejoy was an editor, most of the mail, if you took a bag of mail or a shipment of mail, most of the weight was actually newspapers. That's mostly what was moving around. So newspapers in one place could learn about what was happening in another place. Then they'd reprint those stories, and they'd trade their newspapers back east with the other. And so it created a kind of an exchange that left Americans able to see what was going on in their various states. And it left newspapers as a very important part of American life.
One thing we have to get familiar with here as we move on with this episode, and we bring our discussion further into Elijah Lovejoy and the conflicts that he was involved in, is the printing press itself, because he quite literally dies defending the physical printing press. How did printing presses work? What were they made from? How much did they weigh? How much did they cost? What do we know about the 1820s and how they actually physically put the ink onto the paper?
Yeah, well, in the 1820s and 1830s, particularly the 1830s, printing presses really evolved quite dramatically, and so the simple version evolved into a much more sophisticated version as mass printing took over by the middle of the 1830s. Lovejoy's press was rather a simple affair. It's got a wooden frame with this iron kind of a headboard, if you will. It's got this lever apparatus that lowers this big, heavy iron piece down onto a plate and you've got the letters, the letters that make up the type are placed there. Ink is brushed on, and the paper is literally, pressed between weight and letters. And so you make an impression that way. It's a one-person operation, and Lovejoy worked mostly alone. He had a couple of helpers, but this is before mechanization. The most sophisticated piece of machinery on his press was a lever that you pull down to actually lower this weight. It's a simple apparatus, but the cost of setting up a newspaper office in those days could run maybe $1,500 to have everything. The press itself didn't cost that much, but all of the rest of what you'd need to run a newspaper. And Lovejoy would end up going through rather a bunch of these things. Because he was attacked multiple times, or his newspapers were, he lost several printing presses to mobs, to attackers.
And we're going to get into those attacks, but I have one more question about these printing presses. So did you have to arrange every single letter in the right formation in order to do each page each time?
Yeah, it was time consuming and pretty tedious work, but yes.
Better him than me. All right. Although it might be the one thing that could get me to shut my mouth a little bit, right, and conserve my words a little better. What is the difference? And let's get into the anti-slavery and the pro-slavery arguments here, and some of the contours of this discussion that he found himself in and that he injected himself into. What was the difference in being called, in just being against slavery or being called an abolitionist? You didn't want to be labeled an abolitionist if you wanted peaceful nights of sleep. And I wonder, is it sort of like being called a socialist today? That's kind of a pejorative term that is used. Totally, of course, different meanings. I'm not equating one or the other. I'm just asking about the rhetorical technique used here. Again, the difference between just being against slavery and being called an abolitionist.
Yeah, if in our times, we think of abolitionists as a good thing, right? Because they were people who stood up against this terrible institution. But in Lovejoy's time, to be an abolitionist was to be a radical, not just a radical, but perhaps crazy. Abolitionists were often labeled as people who didn't care about the Union. They didn't care about whether the country fell apart or flew apart, into its different sections. So at Lovejoy's time, and I'm talking about the 1830s, to be called an abolitionist was almost fighting words. This was a dangerous characterization, and he avoided it. There were many people, and he would be among them at the beginning of his fight. He evolved, but at the beginning of his fight, he would be in the gradualist camp, we would say. He was against slavery, as many people were. Even people, you could say in the South, would say they were against slavery. They thought it was a bad institution and that it would at some point wither away. In the North, there were many people who took the position that the answer to the problem of slavery was a program they called colonization. This is a strategy that sought to kind of solve the nation's race problem by deporting blacks freed from slavery to Africa. And there was a colony set up there, which is where Liberia is today. And Lovejoy was part of that initially. So this is the most accommodationist kind of position you could take. It's to say, yeah, I'm against slavery, but we're not ready to emancipate all of these slaves, 2.5 million slaves at this time. We're not ready to emancipate all of these people from their bondage because, all hell could break loose. And in the North, we have to remind ourselves there was a very, very rampant, racist belief that blacks were inferior, that blacks could not handle that kind of independence. And so there were many fearful people in the North, we must remember, who were, against slavery, but not willing to go to the length of being an abolitionist. And those people believed that people who are in slavery should be freed, and they should be freed as soon as we can do it. And Lovejoy would eventually become one of them.
How does he start to marry newspaper publishing and his abolitionist or let's end slavery stances?
Yeah, this is really the heart of the book and the heart of his story. He marries these two parts of himself. He's a Presbyterian preacher and he's a newspaper editor. And he was a newspaper editor before he was a preacher. So he takes these two roles and he blends them into one. He becomes the editor of a religious newspaper called The Observer, first in St. Louis, and then, as we'll learn, he is chased out of there and goes across the river to Illinois. And in the newspaper, he begins to address slavery very tentatively, very cautiously at first. He doesn't demand emancipation. He's most concerned at the time, from a religious perspective, that the owners of slaves, those who hold people in bondage, are attending to the spiritual need of the enslaved people that they hold. That is, that they're allowing religious instruction, that they're taking them to church on Sundays. This is about as far as Lovejoy wants to go at first in his newspaper. But as he writes about slavery, and as he sees in his environment there in St. Louis, the slavery industry, the trafficking, the traders, he becomes more and more outspoken. And as the reaction against that steps up, he becomes even more ambitious, more radicalized, you could say. So he ends up in this role as both a newspaper editor and a preacher, becoming really radicalized through the process of the opposition that comes at him.
Who else was speaking out against slavery? Some of the names we know. What were they saying, and where did he fit into the national discussion?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
He was a bit player, you could say, in the abolitionist cause. People knew who he was, but he was no national leader. He was, for one thing, he was out on the fringes of the country geographically. The abolitionist movement was largely centered in the East, in New York and Boston. So you had people like William Lloyd Garrison, who was a very outspoken abolitionist who had a newspaper that he ran out of Boston called The Liberator. And Garrison was, by Lovejoy's standards, too radical. He was too outspoken. His demands for immediate emancipation and a brand of abolitionism that actually sought civil rights, equal rights for freed blacks. This was to many people really, really out there. But Garrison was at the front of a very important, movement in the anti-slavery cause. To Lovejoy's perspective, at least at first, Garrison was way too far over to the edge. Lovejoy, as he went along, and this is what I found fascinating about researching, his life, is I love it when people change. I love to see an evolution. You don't want to have a static hero, right? He was really quite flawed, in my eyes, at the beginning, and too cautious, and you kind of wonder, why aren't you speaking out more? And then as he goes, along, he changes, and he begins to sound a lot more like the people who he had castigated earlier for being too radical.
What was he up against in Missouri? If you go to Missouri now, there is a very prominent exhibit about the, I guess it's the Fugitive Slave Act, and the right next to the Golden Arch, or the Golden Arches, that's McDonald's, right next to the
the arch.
That's a funny mistake. Right next to the arch, the St. Louis Arch, there's the courthouse where a very important slavery case was decided, and you can go in and walk through and learn about that. Missouri has a history and was at that point a slave state, and he's up against there's a gag rule in the state of Missouri where you can't even publish about slavery. This was a really hostile environment for him to be publishing against slavery in.
One of the things that I just love about the Lovejoy story, and that really impresses me about him, is that It's all well and good to criticize slavery, sling arrows from the, cozy confines of a northeastern city where, not much bad is going to happen to you. Lovejoy was doing it from exactly within a place that had people who were involved in the trade of slaves, in the institution of slavery. Missouri had slavery itself, so people were enslaved inside Missouri. It was also, St. Louis was also, as its position on the Mississippi would have it, an important trading point. So what Lovejoy was doing by even broaching the topic of slavery was he was poking the bear. He was telling his neighbors, the elites of the city, that there was something morally wrong about what they were doing. And probably as much to the point, he was threatening, in their eyes, he was threatening the commercial viability of St. Louis by threatening to poison its relationship with southern states, with which they did a lot of trading, both in goods and in people.
And so how many people in Missouri are looking at this going, listen, I understand part of what he's saying. Slavery is not great. And I don't like seeing people, human beings, being carried around in shackles and sold and families broken up and all the rest of it. I don't like that. But I'm not thrilled with the idea of spoiling the economy.
Yeah, I think that the point about the economy is just so critical here, and it goes kind of beyond the economy. You could call it the social order.
Yeah.
That people thought he was really upsetting the whole game. That by questioning slavery, something as central as slavery, he was threatening the economic viability, but he was also threatening the calm of a city. And in those days, people took it upon themselves to enforce the order. There were no real police forces to speak of. It was really kind of the Wild West situation. There was there would be organized town, city meetings, community meetings, to try to persuade Lovejoy to knock it off, to stop publishing about slavery. And he just insisted that it was his right and he could do so, and that what he was doing was protected by the Constitution and by God, in his words. So he saw his role as being completely covered. He was completely protected, and he wasn't moved by this idea that you're threatening to upset the apple cart here.
One thing I want to get into here is the threat of the violence. I have published many, many things that people haven't liked, including powerful people. My day job is as a TV news reporter. I have published things people don't like, whether it be a criminal, or maybe someone did something wrong and the police are after them, or there's just a dispute and people may not have agreed with my characterizations. Maybe a powerful person called me the next day and said, hey, I didn't like the way you wrote that, or maybe we should have a meeting to discuss why I said what I said. Maybe only one time, and I'm having even trouble remembering exactly what it was, maybe only one time has someone maybe gone too far in, I don't want to use the word threat, but in basically saying you better not write something like that again. This is something that he dealt with, Elijah Lovejoy dealt with, the threat of the violence numerous times, several times. At what point does he start to realize, and how and why, that people may not just write a letter to the editor and might do something worse?
Well, he can recognize that there's really nobody to appeal to. He writes about his right to publish, but knows full well that the elites, the powers that be in St. Louis are not really going to protect him. Quite to the contrary. He gets into a running dispute with a judge there after a case of the lynching of a free biracial man, and Lovejoy in the newspaper expresses horror over this episode. And the judge, who's in charge of instructing the grand jury, finds that there's no crime that can be prosecuted here because it was a whole big crowd that took part in this lynching. So who would you punish for this? Well, Lovejoy finds this ridiculous legal reasoning, and he writes this long screed about this judge and his terrible reasoning. And by that point, and it is we're talking about 1836 here. By that point, Lovejoy's already received threats. The judge has held him up, Lovejoy up, and his newspaper held literally a copy of the St. Louis Observer in his hand in the courtroom and said, this is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of writing, these are the kind of crazy people who are going to incite rebellion among the slaves of Missouri. So by this point, Lovejoy knows that there's really no tenable way he can stay in St. Louis, and he decides to go across the river to Illinois, which is a free state, and where he imagines that he probably will be
I won't have any problem there.
A little more welcomed, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any problem there. So it's quite a dramatic exit. He publishes a letter, or I guess he publishes an article and says, I'm leaving, I'm going to Illinois. And he tries to, as best I understand it, hide his printing press on the Illinois side, and the Illinois side was not exactly safe from the Missouri side, or at least the ideas of the Missouri side.
Yeah, so on his day, on the day that he's leaving, his office gets trashed, his belongings get thrown into the river. He manages to get the press out of there and get it across the river, spirits it over to the Illinois side, to the city of Alton, where it sits there on the dock waiting for him to pick it up, and a mob comes over across the river and trashes it there. So he arrives in this new state, in a new city, where he presumably is going to be safe to publish what he wants to publish. And his introduction to the place is that his printing press has been demolished, and he has to start all over again.
The 1830s in Illinois, there happens to be another, I guess at this point, he's maybe, a little younger than Elijah Lovejoy is, but Abraham Lincoln, I guess, is born in 1809, so 27 or so, 28 years old. He's a little bit younger, but he's being nurtured in the same environment now that Elijah Lovejoy is in, which is Free State, Illinois. Just as an aside, what do we know about how Abraham Lincoln was observing this fight between pro-slavery forces and a press that was dedicated at least to changing or ending slavery?
Well, we know that he was paying some attention, because when the story is, finally ended, and Lovejoy is killed by a mob in Alton, Illinois, Lincoln, in a speech, refers to this event and laments the killing of an editor and then throwing presses into the river and this sort of thing. So it was something that he obviously had been paying some attention to. I don't find any evidence that Lovejoy had any contact with Lincoln, during those years, or that Lincoln, in any way, sought to reach out to Lovejoy. In those days, it was, including in Illinois, as well as in St. Louis, the prevalence of mobs was...
I was going to get to that, yeah.
Yeah. For us in 2021, looking back, it's a little hard to picture, but the 1830s, the very period Lovejoy inhabited here, was the period with the most mob violence of any period in American history. There were all kinds of reasons for mob violence in all kinds of parts of the country. Some of it was interethnic, some of it was just sort of like gang violence, some of it was aimed at immigrants, some of it was religious based, it was aimed against Catholics. In the case of where Lovejoy was, mobs were after him because of his abolitionist views. And in the period of time that Lovejoy is going through these trials across the North, the largest number of mob attacks, of mob violence, was directed against anti-slavery activists. They were the biggest target of violent mobs. There, as I said before, there were really no police around. There was hardly any institutional break, against this kind of violence. They just they were rampant.
And can we connect the desperation, the economic desperation that was in these areas and across the country to this idea of mob violence?
The mob violence preceded the real big economic downturn of 1837, but I don't think that there's any way you can ignore the fact that by the time things are really coming to a head, involving Lovejoy and his continuing clashes with those people who want him to stop publishing about slavery, even in Illinois, the economic pain that people were feeling during what was called the Panic of 1837. It was an early depression across the country, and there had been wild speculation and too much money being printed, and land values collapsed, and it was a giant bubble that collapsed, and it hit the area where Lovejoy lived really hard too. So I think that there was probably a good bit of frustration over having this person in their midst criticizing them and talking about slavery. And he even drew a link between the hard times, as they were called, and slavery by saying greed is what got us here. This is a bubble, and that's what got us into this mess. And what caused this bubble? The same kind of greed that leads us, some people, to enslave other human beings. So he drew this link between slavery and greed, and at a time when people probably would have loved to have heard a very soothing message from a pastor who also happened to run the newspaper, he had nothing but, really a finger to wag at them.
Let's go through November 6th, 1837. It's a hard day. It perhaps maybe we don't need a whole holiday for it, but maybe there should be more press around what happened on this day, November 6th, 1837. It's 4 days after he makes a really incredible and beautiful pronouncement of press freedom, and the mob comes after him. I guess take us through what he said first, and then take us through this dramatic and frankly awful day in American history.
Yeah, for Lovejoy, the last days of October and early November really marked the height of his battle for the press and for speech and for American liberty. He had been attacked repeatedly. By this point, 3 different printing presses had been destroyed on different occasions. The house where his wife's family lived and where he was staying was stormed by a mob while he was there. They literally were having to fight these armed men away inside their house. They stormed the house. He was stalked and threatened on a roadside. He was, in other words, he felt like a hunted man. And the powers that be in Alton, Illinois, who were trying to get him to stop, held a number of community meetings trying to persuade him, lay off, just have your newspaper, but don't talk about slavery. And he continued to resist that. A few days before his death, he delivered a really beautiful speech in which he compared himself to a partridge on the mountain, being hunted by these people who wanted to do him in, and that nobody had come to his assistance, that no authority had ever come forward, but that this wasn't his problem. This was their problem. He had the right to publish. So it was very clear by this point that if he continued, this was not going to end well. And he decided to get a 4th press. The press was delivered kind of secretly. They had a whole kind of cloak and dagger operation to ship the press to the port, to the dock there in Alton. His friends spirited the press into the warehouse where a friend of his had volunteered to let him store the press. Lovejoy had some really good friends there, and one of them was the owner of this warehouse. Word got out that Lovejoy and some friends had gathered in this warehouse where the press was, and soon from the taverns and the watering holes of Alton, a mob assembled, and they marched on over to the warehouse and started demanding through the windows, give us the press, give us the press. We will take it at the risk of our lives. Inside, Lovejoy's friends were armed and waiting, to see what would happen, hoping that cooler heads would prevail. As it turned out, cooler heads, did not prevail. The crowd got more aggressive. Stones were thrown, shots were fired, then shots are fired from inside the warehouse out, and the whole thing becomes this really chaotic scene of a riot. Really, there's a man in the crowd outside who's been wounded, and the crowd has decided to try to set fire to the warehouse to try to smoke them out, get them out of the warehouse, and get the press. That people put a ladder up against the warehouse to try to set fire to the roof and do so. So inside, here's this scene where Lovejoy and his closest friends, who've been through thick and thin, through a lot of trials, now literally besieged. They're imprisoned. Their warehouse that they're in is on fire, and the only way out of the warehouse was a doorway on the ground floor that was under the view of some of the gunmen outside. They took positions outside the door, and they were ready to shoot whoever came out of the building. Lovejoy and a couple of his friends with guns came out of the building in order to try to see if they could get the person who was lighting fire to the building. And Lovejoy was immediately hit in a hail of bullets.
And he ran back into the building and was able to get upstairs, but he died right there in the building with his beloved printing press.
He did. The building was stormed as soon as after Lovejoy died inside the building. He was able to say, I am shot, and died. And at that point, those inside the building decided to flee. They were promised, they would be able to leave safely, though when they left the building, they were fired upon. And the mob found the printing press up on the top floor and threw it down onto the ground level, and then took it down to the dock and smashed it to pieces and threw it, as they had on other occasions with other presses, into the Mississippi River. And that was the end of the Alton Observer, as run by Elijah Lovejoy.
Why does safeguarding the unjustifiable breed lawlessness?
I think in this case, it was a matter of preserving some sense of order. I think that what he was doing, what he was saying, was just so beyond the pale for the community around him. And that is not to say that everybody was against him, hardly. He had a number of religious allies who were his friends through the worst of it. But to many people in the community, he was a troublemaker. And what he was saying just didn't need to be said. And I think this is where, Lovejoy's role in our history is just so important. Abolitionism, or the anti-slavery cause, however we want to define each of those terms, is really the first challenge or the first test of the First Amendment in this country. There really hadn't been any cause or event that really put the First Amendment to the test in the way that abolitionism did. So he was out there in front, testing to see if the freedoms that the founders had written down actually work, and that was just too much for people at the time.
Did he ever intend to become a martyr at 34? Would he have looked back and said that was worth it?
He had a wife and a little kid. She was pregnant at the time as well when he was killed. So as a family person, he was really well aware of his situation. He had this young wife. She was terrified so much of the time. She had been traumatized by these attacks. During the last week or so, I mean, she was sheltering in bed, basically. She was so, overwrought by all of the pressure that was coming down. So in that sense, I don't know if he would have wanted to put her through that kind of pain that he ultimately did. But on the other hand, if you read his words, there's no mistaking that this man was determined to take it as far as it needed to go. He had said earlier, "I may die here, and so be it. If that's what this duty requires, then that's what I must do." And so, that takes us back to his early origins, right? In Maine, in this religious home, the kind of moral certainties in which he grew up. He, I believe, was from a moral and religious point of view, he was quite ready to be a martyr.
Two important people, well, many important people, but two people whose names we know today react to this death. We mentioned Abraham Lincoln's reaction. Tell us about John Quincy Adams, the old anti-slavery stalwart, and how he reacted to this.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams, of course, had been the president of the United States, and then not, and then he was a congressman from Massachusetts. And during this period, when Lovejoy is publishing, John Quincy Adams is fighting his own war in Washington to counter an effort by pro-slavery politicians in the Congress to prevent any discussion of slavery in the House of Representatives. It's quite a surprise, or it was to me, as a journalist and not a historian of this period, when I did the research for this book, to discover that not only in the case of Lovejoy and the mobs that attacked anti-slavery activists, but there were many efforts across American society to stanch any discussion of slavery, to stop it, and including the House of Representatives, which passed a gag rule that lasted for 8 years, and Adams was one of the great irritants of the pro-slavery camp, because he kept finding ways to bring slavery into the discussion in the House and frustrating their efforts to keep it out. Anyway, after Lovejoy is killed, Adams describes this as an earthquake that would be felt across the land, that this is a monumental event. And in some ways, he was exaggerating. Lovejoy died, yes, and the country didn't erupt in an earthquake or a volcano or anything like that. But it did have an effect in the North to really infuriate people. And a lot of the North was just outraged, horrified at the idea that a newspaper editor would be killed in this way. And it reminded Northerners that, their civil rights, white Northerners, that their civil rights were threatened by the so-called slave power. And it led many of them to take a fonder view of abolitionism and even to join the movement themselves.
You wrote a beautiful introduction. One of the things in the introduction is the point that you make is even little pokes against press freedom can impact the larger press freedom that we enjoy today in the United States. What do you want to say about what this story and how this story reflects on our need to keep the First Amendment sacred to everybody, but especially the press?
Yeah, I want to say, and as I know you're a journalist, I'm a journalist, and we kind of get this already. But to everyone else, I hope that a message that comes through in the book is that this didn't just come out. When I say this, press freedom didn't come out fully baked. And there it was. And one of the lessons that I try to impart to my Chinese students, who live in a climate, of course, where the press is censored heavily, where there's not a lot of freedom of expression. One of the messages I wanted to impart was, don't look at us and think we just got handed this. We were born with a silver spoon. We had to actually go out and fight for these rights, to expand these rights. And we can see the course of this fight over, across Supreme Court cases across the 20th century, and where the press, has gotten greater rights. But it was also fought by people. And Lovejoy is a name. He's a human being. He's a person who had the courage all by himself out there. And, you and I as journalists know that journalism takes a lot of courage sometimes in different settings. This guy was doing it by himself, and showed so much integrity, I thought, and I think that if people can appreciate the sacrifices that have been made, it will remind them that those rights can also be squandered and lost.
What should we do to keep the story of Elijah Lovejoy alive today, along with reading your book? That's number one.
The book is number one. Absolutely.
That's number one.
I mean, I think that we have to pay attention to the situation around us. Look at today. We had a mob insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in January, and if you watch the course of that crowd as they made their way, to the Capitol, the first target before they got to the Capitol was the press. They rampaged there. They attacked equipment of cameras and recording equipment of journalists who were there to cover the events. There were people with T-shirts with a logo, of murder the media. And when you can go and see, T-shirts on the internet with a message that says,
rope tree journalist.
Tree journalist, some assembly required. You're talking about a climate in which it's just not safe it's not as safe to be a journalist as it should be. And part of that is because we've just, endured a period of time where the president was, castigating journalists as enemies of the people and dismissing, journalism, free and independent journalism, as fake news. So I think, culturally, Americans need to pay attention to what's going on around them and to realize that this can happen, in a way that, at a speed that they never would have thought possible.
Is there an Elijah Lovejoy of today?
Well, I think that anybody who's out there who is practicing journalism in an honest way and who is, speaking truth to power and writing the stories that need to be written is acting in the spirit of Elijah Lovejoy. And there are many, 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 many journalists who are doing that. And I'm very proud to be a journalist, and I'm proud of those who continue to carry on that sort of tradition.
Ken Ellingwood, the author of First to Fall, Elijah Lovejoy and the Fight for a Free Press in the Age of Slavery. Thanks so much for being here.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Evan.
Certainly check out that book and his Twitter feed, which is @Ken Ellingwood. I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page. To ask for your support in keeping the show going, go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We just made a donation from your contributions to Reach Out and Read, a program that makes books a part of the pediatric healthcare process. And we will make more of those donations. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.